Hello, and welcome to Off the Books, where we surf the uncharted waters of accounting, finance, risk, and wherever else the waves take us. This episode is brought to you by Workiva, the one platform that unites financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk teams so they can work better together, like Oreos with milk or Diet Coke and Steve Soder. My name is Catherine Tsai, professional asker of questions. I like to drink venti soy chais, and I'm here today with Steve Soder. Steve, why don't you remind everybody who you are?
Happy to, Catherine. Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Soder, accounting enthusiast and Diet Coke aficionado. I am, as always, looking forward to debating a great conversation, and I'm so happy to have you all joining us.
And who's here with us today?
Well, we are delighted, Catherine, to be joined today by returning guest Brandon Ziegler, who is Workiva's general counsel and an all-around great guy. As many of our listeners know, the SEC adopted a rule on cybersecurity earlier this year, which, among other things, requires disclosures of hacks, breaches, or cyber incidents within 4 business days of a company determining that the incident was material. And I'll tell you, this is the kind of rule where you're definitely going to need to bring in your legal counsel, and so we did the exact same thing. Brandon, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here again.
So to start off, how would you frame this SEC cybersecurity rule and the importance of it to your colleagues, the board, and your employee base at large, Brandon?
Well, it's a really important development. As people know, the 8K disclosure of a cybersecurity incident, the company deems to be material. It has to be made within 4 business days of that materiality determination. And in the 8K filing, you've got to describe all the material aspects of the incident's nature, scope, and timing, as well as its material impact or reasonably likely material impact on the company.
Okay, so Brandon, just to get us started here, for those who might not be familiar, can you just frame up what we're talking about when we mean materiality for purposes of SEC reporting?
Sure. As a foundational principle, materiality refers to the matter of whether a piece of information would likely be important to the reasonable investor.
Got it. Pretty straightforward.
But the key question, I think, is how do you actually assess that materiality for the purposes of whether you need to file an 8K to begin with?
Well, and I'll be honest with you, Brandon, that's where I'd love to jump in, because over the last few months, as I think financial reporting teams have been digesting this rule, the question that keeps coming up again and again is exactly that. How do you determine which cyber incidents are material? And I've heard practitioners tell me that like their IT teams or even their legal counsel, which is a little bit surprising, have been asking them, the financial reporting teams, for a dollar amount or a threshold on materiality, which is baffling because, I mean, as you know, it just doesn't work that way. So from my standpoint, cyber incidents are going to involve a lot of mostly non-financial factors, which I think is going to make it somewhat challenging for these financial reporting teams to even begin to provide that guidance. And so I guess, Brandon, and you and I have talked about this before, where would you even start on that kind of analysis?
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. I think when you're thinking about materiality in respect of disclosing cyber incidents, there's really not a financial threshold, or at least I don't take that perspective, although that may be a helpful perspective from someone else. But I think, the way to think about it is there's several different indicia of evidence that I would consider in making a materiality determination. The first one would be whether there's any known data loss or unauthorized access versus just uncertainty around whether the data was accessed. Between the time that you may believe an incident has occurred and the time that you really get your hands around what happened, it can be a lot of unknowns. It can be a very uncomfortable time. You don't know everything. You don't have a lot of information, or you only have partial information. And so making that first determination whether there's actually a data loss or unauthorized access versus just uncertainty is critical. The second thing that I think about is if there has been any access been with a company or an individual that is not already authorized or who is not under existing confidentiality obligations or existing access and use restrictions. If the data is accessed by a company that you already have a contract with that's required to keep that information confidential or to use it in a certain way, it's a much lower risk posed to the data loss. The third important component to think about is whether there's been any identity theft. That's always foremost on the minds of regulators. So to determine that is key, and whether the data has been made public or whether it's kept within the channels of you and your company and some other entity or individual, again, that may or may not be authorized to see the data. Another litmus test is to see whether there are any customer complaints. Is your customer success team all of a sudden fielding a lot of complaints from customers, which may give you an indication of the severity of the data loss?
Brandon, as you think about the list, which is great, by the way, because who doesn't love a good checklist? So thank you for that. But as you go through this, I'm assuming that on any given cyber incident, and I'm not an expert, but I would assume that some of these, there may be very clear known answers. Some of them might be unknown, or we have a hunch, or we have a guess. And then as you go through all of those, you probably end up creating some kind of a picture or a view of like, okay, we've sort of started to put maybe not guardrails, but at least we started to assess the available information. Do you then take a step back, look at that entire picture, and then think, okay, if I was outside the company, if I was a shareholder, if I was an investor, would this picture trip the threshold of materiality? Again, I don't know if that's the case, but I'm just wondering, is that maybe the next step after you've gone through this process and answered these questions?
Well, that's a great point, a great question. You want to think about the perspective of the public. And who might that public be? Would it be the customers, investors, regulators? They're all going to have a different perspective on what this the data loss might mean to them.
The other thing that stuck out to me when you were reading that list, Brandon, was how much of a good relationship you have to have with different functions across your company. The teams that stuck out to me were IT. You also mentioned customer success. I'm sure there's other teams that you'd want to be consulting to as you assess materiality.
Yeah, so the key team to be engaged with is your cybersecurity team. And it's maybe a good idea to have a regular cadence of meetings with your InfoSec team to go over all security incidents that happen, even ones that may seem minor. There's a difference between a security incident and a security breach, which is a legal term of art. And you want to make sure that you're getting all this information as readily as possible. So key to be with your InfoSec team, key to be with your customer success team. Those are probably the two most important that I can think of. And your chief, if you have a chief information officer, that would also be really helpful.
When you think about this process that we've just talked about, coordinating with these teams, assessing these questions, it seems like documentation also becomes really, really important. Because I could certainly imagine that, let's say you do get to the point where you've determined that an incident is material, you need to then disclose it within those 4 days. But I've got to believe that the SEC is going to start looking at that time period from when the incident happened to 4 days before you filed the AK, and then start to look, okay, like, was that a week? Was that a month? Was that maybe the better part of the year? I have no idea. And I'm guessing that documentation becomes really, really important so you can start to lay out what did you know and when did you know it, so you can start to build that case to show that, like, hey, we've been working feverishly to get to the bottom of this assessment from the very beginning. How do you think about that from a general counsel standpoint? Certainly limiting that kind of liability, I think, would be high on your list of concerns or areas that you'd want to be sure the company gets it right.
Definitely, especially when you're thinking from the perspective of a regulator, you're going to want to be able to preserve all your sensitive information. So what are the steps you might take, and how do you gather information? Who, in what manner, and how will this information be preserved? Location by location, network by network, to preserve materials behind the scenes and logs for regulators. So the way I think about that also is, it's sort of containment. You know the universe, who had unauthorized access. It's a reputational issue. It's hard to know how customers are going to feel. So you want to gather all this information in a really as much as you can to preserve that record, and to also have the relationships in the company to know who to talk to at leadership levels to make sure that technically you're able to preserve that information.
Are you relying on desktop tools and shared drives? Stuck in a vicious, never-ending cycle of back-and-forth emails? Wish you had more time to proactively manage risks? Stop wasting valuable time corralling colleagues and updating status reports, and start spending more time on what matters with Workiva. Create alignment across key stakeholders, yes, all of them, with centralized collaboration. Drive better business decisions with insights on demand, and spend more time on value-added work by automating those awful repetitive tasks. Plus, Connect your GRC processes with your ESG and financial reporting all in the same platform. Seriously. See why audit and risk teams love Workiva at workiva.com/risk. That's WORKIVA.com/risk.
It's a good idea to have a tabletop exercise, gather everybody around to know who's who and what you're going to do when an incident happens. But then you want to make sure that you are going beyond just that tabletop and really building your relationships in the organization with all these leaders to know exactly how to respond to a real incident.
I imagine there's probably different levels at which you'd be affected, whether it's a federal or state or even narrower than that.
Sure. I mean, the way I would look at from a strictly legal standpoint, in terms of compliance, the federal level, we talked about, identity theft and materiality for an 8K. And then you also have to think about insider trading. You want to make sure that no one's trading if there is an incident occurring, before you know whether it's a breach or not. At the state level, state regulators have laws that talk about reporting unauthorized access of usernames or passwords for financial accounts. The materiality threshold there is typically whether there's a meaningful impact on people. And some actually statutes say it's not even an incident if the inadvertent disclosure has been made to a party that's already authorized, sort of hearkening back to the materiality assessment.
And Brandon, it occurs to me that for maybe a company who might shockingly have no incident response plan, may have a very loosely defined, cybersecurity team. I mean, is the first place to start actually going through those what-if exercises, putting together a response plan itself so that then at least you have some place to turn if something like this were to happen? I'm just wondering where would be the first place to start that not only helps, of course, resolve incidents, but also helps lessen potential liability, either to regulators or to others who may be harmed by whatever this incident might become.
Well, yeah, I mean, you want to have to set up the initial tabletop exercise. You want to be always building your relationship inside the company with all these leaders to make sure that when an incident really happens, you're able to process it effectively and you get ahead of the curve. But to your latter point there, it's important to always remember that in these incidents, there can be actual human beings involved. And you have to always be thinking about the people that might potentially be affected. And so it's important from the GC's perspective to make sure that everyone is doing the right thing. And that, yes, we have our eye on liability, yes, we have our eye on remediation, but we also want to make sure that we're focused on, any individuals that might actually be affected by this kind of an event.
That's a great point. Very good point. See, I'm always thinking about the liability and the disclosures. That's what we like about you, Brandon. You're thinking about the people. Thank you.
It's a blended approach.
You have any final takeaways for our listeners before we get to the closing question of the day?
As a final takeaway, I think whenever you have an incident, it's always a good opportunity to conduct a post-incident review. Make sure that, everybody makes mistakes. You can always do things better. Figure out what you did right. Figure out what you did wrong. Ask yourselves the hard questions. And, these are difficult events to deal with. And, you work in good faith. You do the best you can. And I think it's an area where can always be continuous improvement. So I would recommend that you always conduct a post-incident review.
And if nothing else, that could definitely inform whatever that incident response plan was, right? So then you just have this almost virtuous cycle of becoming better and better prepared. Not to suggest that that's exactly the right answer, but it occurs to me that would be a very logical, sensible activity to do after, coming out of a cyber incident.
Absolutely. You can only, these things move fast and they change every time. And you can only get better each time you process one of these incidents.
Great. Well, before we let you go, we have to sneak in our closing question. When someone in the company needs to get a hold of you right away for your legal expertise, what's the best way 9 times out of 10 to get a hold of you?
Asking for a friend.
Texting. That's the truth. There's so many different forms of communication that if something's really urgent, people tend to text me.
I'm sure the right people have your phone number. I don't, but
You can use Slack.
How about you, Catherine? What's your preferred way?
I'm always by the cookie jar. Just go there. Look for me there. How about you, Steve?
Cookie jar. No, I would agree. Text. My problem. So as a company, we use Slack as a messaging system, which is great. The problem is that I feel like Slack is sort of meant to kind of resemble a text message, but when you get so many of them, it becomes almost as useless as email. You have this massive inbox, and so then, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. Generally speaking, text I think remains a pretty good means to cut through all of that.
Great. Well, thank you, Brandon, for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, Brandon, we really appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you, dear listener, for surfing along with us. I'm Steve Soder. That was Catherine Tsai. And this has been Off the Books, presented by Workiva. Please subscribe, leave a review, and as always, tell your buddies if you like the show. If you're watching this on YouTube, we would love for you to leave us a note in the comments, or feel free to drop us a line at offthebooks@workiva.com. Surf's up, and we'll see you on the next wave.